They doubted her, dismissed her, and assumed she wasn't capable. But when Eleanor Carter stepped up to the board with just a piece of chalk, she left the entire class, including her professor, completely speechless. Eleanor Carter walked into the grand lecture hall, her heart steady but her grip on her notebook a little tighter than usual. The room was vast, with towering bookshelves lining the walls, high ceilings echoing faint whispers, and rows of polished wooden desks arranged in ascending tiers. The scent of aged paper and faint traces of chalk dust filled the air, a reminder of the many minds that had passed through these halls before her. At 52, Eleanor was not the typical student in this prestigious university. While the majority of her classmates were young, fresh out of high school, she was here to complete the education she had postponed for decades. Life had taken her on a different path, raising a family, running a business, and navigating responsibilities that often overshadow personal ambitions. But now she was back, determined to prove, to herself and to everyone else, that it was never too late to learn. As she settled into her seat near the front, she could feel the curious, skeptical glances from students around her. A few exchanged amused looks, while others whispered just low enough for her to hear. "Is she auditing the class?" one murmured. "Maybe she got lost and walked into the wrong room," another chuckled. Eleanor ignored them. She had faced worse. Then the lecture hall doors swung open, and in strode Dr. Charles Baldwin, a professor with an intimidating presence and a reputation for breaking students down before building them up. He was known for his sharp tongue, impossible exams, and a strict adherence to academic tradition. He scanned the room, his gaze eventually landing on Eleanor. A flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps amusement, crossed his face before he spoke. Well, it seems we have a seasoned student joining us today," he said, his tone laced with something just short of condescension. The room tensed with suppressed laughter. Eleanor met his gaze, refusing to shrink under his scrutiny. Dr. Baldwin continued, "Tell me, Ms. Carter, do you believe you can keep up with this course?" A challenge, a test. Eleanor sat up straighter, a confident smile forming. "The real question, Professor," she said smoothly, "is whether your class can keep up with me." The whispers stopped. The class wasn't laughing anymore. The room was heavy with silence as Professor Charles Baldwin paced at the front of the lecture hall, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with each deliberate step. He was known for pushing his students, for separating those who merely attended from those who truly understood. But today his attention was focused on Eleanor Carter. At 52, Eleanor was unlike any other student in the class. The others were fresh out of high school, still adjusting to college life, while she had spent decades building a career, raising a family, and navigating challenges these students hadn't even imagined yet. Yet despite her experience, she could feel their skepticism, the lingering assumption that she didn't belong. Professor Baldwin turned to the chalkboard and scrawled out a complex equation, its symbols and variables stretching across the board like a tangled web. He capped the chalk with a sharp tap and turned to face the students. "Let's see who truly understands today's lesson," he said, scanning the room. Then, with a calculated pause, his gaze settled on Eleanor. "Miss Carter," he called out, his voice smooth yet laced with challenge, "why don't you come up and solve this?" The air in the room shifted. Some students sat up straighter, exchanging glances. Others smirked, expecting a spectacle. Eleanor knew exactly what was happening. He was testing her, not just on the problem, but on whether she could handle the pressure, the scrutiny. But Eleanor had spent years proving herself in rooms where she wasn't expected to succeed. This was no different. She exhaled steadily, stood from her seat, and walked to the front with quiet confidence. As she took the chalk in her hand, she could hear the whispers. "She's going to mess it up." She probably doesn't even know where to start. But Eleanor blocked them out. Numbers made sense to her in ways people never had. She studied the problem for a moment, then began to write, not hesitantly, but decisively. Step by step, she worked through the solution, her hands steady, her logic flawless. The room, once filled with murmurs, grew eerily silent. By the time she reached the answer and boxed it neatly, she turned to Baldwin, meeting his gaze without hesitation. He studied the board, lips pressing into a thin line. Then after a long pause, he spoke. Correct. One word. Simple. But in that moment, the entire room saw Eleanor Carter in a new light. The moment Eleanor Carter picked up the chalk, the lecture hall fell silent. The room, once filled with quiet whispers and skeptical glances, now held a tension that was almost palpable. Professor Baldwin stood with his arms crossed, watching her every move with a calculating expression. This was his test, his moment to prove that Eleanor didn't belong. But Eleanor had been tested before, in far greater ways than a classroom challenge. She examined the equation, recognizing its complexity immediately. It was a multivariable function, deliberately designed to trip up even the most prepared students. Instead of hesitating, she took a steady breath and made her first mark on the board. The chalk glided smoothly as she worked through the problem, her hands steady and precise. Instead of following the standard method, she took a shortcut, one only someone with a deep understanding of mathematics would recognize. The whispers in the room shifted. She skipped a step, one student murmured. But she's still right, another added, their tone laced with surprise. Professor Baldwin narrowed his eyes, stepping closer to the board. He wasn't just observing, he was searching for a flaw. Eleanor reached the final step, boxed the answer, and stepped back calmly. She turned to face Baldwin, her expression unwavering. The professor scrutinized the work, tracing each transition with his finger. The longer he stood there, the clearer it became. He wasn't confirming the solution. He was trying to find a mistake. Finally, after a long silence, Baldwin exhaled. Unconventional, he admitted, his voice measured, but absolutely correct. A murmur of astonishment spread through the class. Students who had barely glanced at Eleanor before now looked at her with newfound respect. The woman they had underestimated had just outperformed them all. From the back of the room, Professor Linda Hayes, a respected mathematician, stood and spoke. That wasn't just correct, she said. That was brilliant. Eleanor didn't need their approval, but in that moment, she had changed something, not just in the classroom, but in the way they all saw her. The moment Eleanor Carter placed the chalk down, the air in the lecture hall felt different. The usual hum of whispered conversations, the quiet tapping of pens against notebooks. All of it had disappeared. The students who had initially dismissed her now sat in stunned silence. The ones who had exchanged smug glances before were now leaning forward, eyes locked on the board. Even those who had been indifferent to her presence seemed to be reassessing everything they thought they knew. Professor Baldwin remained at the front of the class, his jaw clenched as he scanned Eleanor's work. He had been so certain she would fail that this would serve as a lesson in overconfidence. But now he stood before a solution so flawlessly executed that even he couldn't challenge its accuracy. From the back of the room, Professor Linda Hayes, a well-respected mathematician, broke the silence. This isn't just correct, she said, stepping forward. This is exceptional. A few students turned to look at Baldwin, waiting for his reaction. Would he acknowledge her brilliance or dismiss it? Baldwin cleared his throat, straightening his posture. An interesting approach, he said carefully. Certainly not the traditional method. Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation, because the traditional method wasn't necessary. A few students exchanged glances, some smirking, others nodding in realization. She hadn't just solved the problem, she had optimized it. The tension in the room slowly began to unravel, replaced by something else. Respect. It wasn't instant, it wasn't unanimous, but it was there, creeping into the expressions of those who had doubted her. One student near the front hesitated before raising his hand. "Professor Baldwin," he asked, "could Eleanor explain how she recognized that shortcut?" "I wouldn't have thought to approach it that way." For the first time that day, Eleanor felt a shift, not just in the room, but in how they saw her. She wasn't just another student anymore. She was the student they wanted to learn from. As the tension in the lecture hall began to settle, a new voice cut through the silence. Dr. Samuel Whitmore, the head of the mathematics department, had been standing quietly at the back of the room, observing everything. A man of unwavering standards and a sharp eye for talent, he rarely spoke unless something truly impressed him. Now he stepped forward, his gaze shifting between Eleanor Carter and the equations she had just solved. "This," he said, gesturing to the board, "is not just correct, it's brilliant." The murmurs in the room grew louder. A few students turned to each other, whispering in surprise. It wasn't every day that Dr. Whitmore handed out such praise. Eleanor remained composed, though she felt the weight of the moment. She had spent her entire academic career proving herself, but hearing those words from one of the most respected figures in the department meant something. Dr. Whitmore took a step closer to the board, examining her work. "You didn't just find the solution," he continued. "You saw a pattern, one that most students wouldn't recognize. You eliminated unnecessary steps without sacrificing accuracy. That kind of thinking isn't just advanced, it's intuitive." Professor Baldwin shifted uncomfortably beside him. He had spent years establishing his dominance in the classroom, and now in front of his students, his authority was being challenged. Whitmore turned to Eleanor. "Tell me," he said, his voice curious rather than condescending, "what led you to approach it this way?" Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. "I recognized that the problem structure allowed for simplifications early on," she said, her voice steady. "Instead of following a rigid process, I identified the core relationships between the variables. From there, it was just a matter of adjusting for efficiency." Dr. Whitmore nodded, impressed. "That kind of reasoning is rare. It's the mark of someone who doesn't just understand mathematics, but sees it." Around the room, students who had once dismissed her were now paying attention, real attention. Professor Baldwin forced a tight-lipped smile. "Well," he said, adjusting his tie, "perhaps Miss Carter has a future in mathematics after all." Dr. Whitmore didn't even glance at him. He was still looking at Eleanor. "She doesn't just have a future," he said plainly. "She's already ahead of most of us." And with that, the classroom had changed forever. The room was still buzzing from Dr. Whitmore's unexpected praise of Eleanor Carter. Students whispered among themselves, their previous doubts about her now replaced with curiosity and even admiration. But Professor Baldwin was not ready to surrender his authority so easily. Clearing his throat, he stepped forward, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well," he said, "while Miss Carter's approach was unconventional, let's not forget that mathematics is about precision and structure. There's a reason we teach step-by-step methods, to ensure students don't rely on shortcuts that might lead to mistakes." He turned back to the board, picking up a piece of chalk. "Let's take another look," he continued, underlining part of Eleanor's solution. "Perhaps we should go through the traditional approach to reinforce the fundamental principles." It was a transparent attempt to undermine Eleanor's achievement, a way to remind the class that he was still the authority in the room. But this time, his usual intimidation tactics weren't working. Dr. Whitmore, still standing with his arms crossed, let out a quiet chuckle. "There's nothing wrong with tradition, Baldwin," he said, "but innovation is what pushes fields forward. I see no errors in Miss Carter's work. Only brilliance. A few students nodded in agreement. Eleanor remained silent, watching as Professor Baldwin hesitated, realizing that his attempt to take back control had just backfired. The power in the room had shifted, and for the first time, it wasn't in his favor. For the first time since Eleanor Carter had stepped into Professor Baldwin's class, the atmosphere had changed. The skepticism that had followed her every move was fading, replaced by something she hadn't expected: respect. As Dr. Whitmore reaffirmed her brilliance, a few students exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from doubt to curiosity. Some began nodding in agreement, while others scribbled notes, trying to understand the shortcut she had seen so clearly. One student, Daniel, who had smirked when Baldwin first called Eleanor to the board, now leaned forward in his seat. "That was impressive," he admitted, his voice lacking the condescension it had carried before. "I wouldn't have even thought to approach it that way." Another student, Lisa, who had spent most of the semester ignoring Eleanor, finally turned to her. "How did you spot that pattern so fast?" she asked, genuine interest in her tone. Eleanor blinked, momentarily surprised. These were the same people who had dismissed her at the start of the semester, the same ones who had whispered behind her back. But now they were seeing her differently. She allowed herself a small smile. "It's about recognizing the structure of the equation," she explained. "If you look closely, some steps are unnecessary." Lisa nodded slowly. "You should speak up more. Some of us could actually learn from you." As Eleanor returned to her seat, she felt a shift. She had walked in as an outsider, but now, for the first time, she belonged. Professor Baldwin had always controlled his classroom with absolute authority. His reputation was built on intimidation, relentless critiques, and an unspoken understanding that only those he deemed worthy could succeed. But today, something had changed. The moment Eleanor Carter solved the problem effortlessly, the control shifted away from him. Students weren't just watching him for approval anymore. They were looking at Eleanor. They were questioning his authority, not because he had done anything different, but because Eleanor had shattered the illusion that his approval determined intelligence. Baldwin cleared his throat, gripping the edge of his podium. "Interesting approach," he said, his voice tight. "Though I would argue the traditional method provides a more structured solution." Dr. Whitmore, however, wasn't letting him reclaim his dominance so easily. "The traditional method is useful," she agreed, her voice calm but firm. "But Eleanor's solution is faster, more efficient. That's what true understanding looks like." A quiet ripple moved through the classroom. For once, Baldwin's word was not final. Eleanor remained composed, but she knew what had just happened. She had stepped into this class as someone to be dismissed. Now she was someone to be reckoned with. As students gathered their things, she caught the subtle glances, the nods of approval, the whispered acknowledgments. She wasn't invisible anymore. And as she walked out the door, she knew that Baldwin felt it too. His control over the room had just cracked. Eleanor Carter had spent a lifetime proving that age was never a barrier to intelligence. Yet when she walked into that classroom on the first day, she could feel the weight of assumptions pressing down on her. She wasn't the typical student. She wasn't young, fresh out of high school, or someone they expected to excel in such an advanced class. She was older, experienced, and completely underestimated. From the whispers behind her back to the dismissive glances from her classmates, it was clear. They had already decided her worth before she even had a chance to speak. But Eleanor knew something they didn't. Wisdom, experience, and knowledge don't expire. When she stood at the front of the class and effortlessly solved the problem that had stumped even the brightest students, the air in the room shifted. The same students who had once doubted her now leaned forward in their seats, watching her with curiosity instead of condescension. Even Professor Baldwin, who had spent years asserting his authority over his students, was forced to acknowledge her brilliance. And in that moment, the stereotype shattered. Age was not a limitation. Intelligence wasn't defined by youth. And Eleanor Carter had just rewritten the expectations placed upon her. As she gathered her things and walked out of the classroom, she knew one thing for certain. From this moment on, no one would ever doubt her again. Eleanor Carter had spent her life overcoming obstacles. She knew what it felt like to be doubted, overlooked, and dismissed before even having the chance to prove herself. But she had never let anyone else define her worth, and she wasn't about to start now. When she walked into that classroom, she knew the odds were stacked against her. Her age, her background, and the preconceived notions of those around her all stood in her way. But she also knew something more important, her own capabilities. She didn't just solve a complex equation that day. She silenced the doubters, challenged expectations, and rewrote the rules. Every stroke of chalk against the board was a declaration that she belonged, that she was just as capable, if not more, than anyone else in the room. Perseverance isn't just about pushing forward. It's about believing in yourself when no one else does. It's about knowing your worth, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. Eleanor didn't need validation from her classmates or even from Professor Baldwin. She knew her value before she ever picked up that chalk. Her story is a reminder to anyone who has ever been told they weren't good enough, weren't the right fit, or didn't belong. You define your own worth. You set your own limits. And when you refuse to be held back by others' expectations, you prove that true strength comes from within. Eleanor Carter's journey wasn't just about proving a point in the classroom. It was about proving a point to herself and everyone who had ever doubted her. Confidence and determination weren't just traits she admired. They were the foundation of everything she had built in her life. When Professor Baldwin tried to dismiss her, he wasn't just challenging her intelligence, he was challenging her resilience. But Eleanor didn't falter. She stood her ground, held her head high, and let her actions speak louder than any assumptions made about her. Confidence isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about believing in your ability to find them. It's about refusing to let fear dictate your path, even when the odds seem against you. Eleanor understood this better than anyone. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that determination is what separates those who succeed from those who give up. It's not about talent alone. It's about perseverance, about having the courage to take the first step and the determination to keep going, even when things get tough. If there's one lesson to take from Eleanor's experience, it's this. Never let others define what you're capable of. Their doubts are not your limits. Their judgments are not your reality. With confidence and determination, you can overcome anything.